The morning sun blazed like hellfire across the Wyoming prairie as Theodore Ramsey rode toward his newly acquired property. The dust kicked up by his horse's hooves swirled in the scorching wind, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. He'd bought the abandoned ranch for exactly $1 at the county auction yesterday. A steal, they said, though looking at the parched landscape of silver-gray earth dotted with sparse buffalo grass, he wondered if he'd been the fool instead. The windmill stood motionless against the cloudless sky, its blades hanging like the broken wings of some great metal bird. Theodore dismounted, his boots crunching on the cracked earth as he approached the main house. The wooden structure leaned slightly eastward, weathered boards bleached bone white by years of unforgiving sun. He pushed open the door, and a cloud of dust erupted into his face. Before he could clear his eyes, the distinctive click of a shotgun hammer made him freeze. "Don't move another inch, or I'll ventilate you where you stand." Through the settling dust, Theodore made out a figure, a young woman with raven-black hair pulled back in a practical bun, her sun-bronzed cheeks flushed with determination. She wore a faded cotton apron over a well-worn dress, and her build was full and strong, the kind of sturdy frame that spoke of hard work and good health. The shotgun in her hands never wavered. "Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Theodore said carefully, keeping his hands visible. "This is my property. I have the deed right here in my pocket." "Your property?" Isabella Delgado's dark eyes flashed dangerously. "You're one of Crowley's men, aren't you? Come to run me off at gunpoint. Well, I've got news for you, mister. I'm not going anywhere." "I don't know any Crowley," Theodore replied, confused. "I bought this ranch at the county auction. They said it was deserted." "Deserted?" Isabella's laugh was bitter. "Deserted to the county, maybe, but I've never left. This has been my home for 6 years, and no piece of paper is going to change that." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but nature intervened. Through the window, they both saw it coming, a wall of dust and sand rolling across the prairie like a tidal wave. The wind hit the house with a violence that rattled every board, and both forgot their quarrel in the face of the common enemy. "Help me with the shutters," Isabella commanded. Setting the gun aside, they worked in tandem, slamming wooden shutters closed, stuffing rags under the door. The storm howled like a living thing, trying to claw its way inside. In the sudden darkness, they found themselves pressed close in the small kitchen. Theodore could smell the sage and sweat on her, the faint scent of cornbread from the oven. When she reached past him for the water gourd, their bodies collided awkwardly. Pardon me," he mumbled, stepping back and nearly knocking over a pot of beans bubbling on the stove. "Watch it." Isabella steadied the pot, her face flushing deeper. "That's dinner you're about to waste." "Sorry, I'm not much use in a kitchen. Coffee's about all I can manage." Despite the tension, Isabella's lips twitched. "A man who admits his limitations, that's refreshing." They shared the water gourd in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. Theodore pulled out his papers, squinting to read them in the dim light filtering through the cracks. "Bill of sale, dated yesterday. 1 deserted ranch, including all structures and water rights. That's what it says." "Deserted," Isabella repeated, her voice tight. "My parents are buried out back. I've tended this place alone since the fever took them last winter. Maybe I don't have fancy papers, but this is my home." Theodore studied her face in the half-light. Pride warred with desperation in her expression, and something in her fierce determination stirred his respect. He'd known too many people pushed off their land by men with money and guns. He'd be damned if he'd become one of them. When the wind finally died to a whisper, they ventured outside. The landscape had been rearranged, drifts of sand piled against the buildings like snow. The sun hung low and red on the horizon, painting everything the color of dried blood. "I'll sleep on the porch," Theodore offered. "We can sort this out proper in the morning." Isabella nodded stiffly. "See that you stay there. I'll still have my shotgun handy. That night, Theodore lay on the hard boards, staring up at the stars through the gaps in the porch roof. He could hear Isabella moving inside, the creak of floorboards, the soft clink of dishes. He'd come here seeking solitude and a fresh start, hoping to outrun the ghosts that haunted him from his days stringing telegraph wire. Instead, he'd found a complication in the form of a strong-willed woman with fire in her eyes. He bought a deserted ranch for $1, he muttered to himself with a wry smile, and found a curvy woman already living inside. It sounded like the beginning of one of those dime novels the fellows used to pass around in the railway camps. A coyote howled in the distance, and the wind carried the scent of alkali and sage. Theodore shifted on the hard boards, his mind turning over possibilities. The legal thing would be to enforce his claim, have the sheriff remove her. But legal and right weren't always the same thing out here. He'd seen too many families destroyed by legal papers backed by money and force. Come morning, when Isabella emerged with a cup of coffee, strong and black, just how he liked it, Theodore made his proposal. "Here's what I'm thinking," he said, accepting the cup gratefully. "You know this land, and I need to learn it. I can fix that windmill, get water flowing again. We share the work and the water. Meantime, we figure out the legal way to make this right for both of us." Isabella studied him suspiciously. "And why would you do that? You could have the sheriff here by noon to throw me out." "Maybe," Theodore admitted. "But I've seen enough folks forced off their land. Your people built that well, tended this place. That counts for something in my book." She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll see if you keep your word. Theodore Ramsey, we'll see." As the sun climbed higher, already promising another scorching day, they stood together surveying the ranch. The work ahead would be hard, fixing the windmill, clearing the sand, coaxing life from the stubborn earth. But for the first time in months, Theodore felt something like hope stirring in his chest. Maybe he'd found more than just a homestead in this desolate place. Maybe he'd found a chance at redemption, and perhaps something more, if he was brave enough to reach for it. Theodore Ramsey had learned early that life rarely dealt fair hands. At 32, he carried the weight of too many memories, orphaned at 8 when scarlet fever swept through his Kansas town, taking his parents and leaving him to the uncertain mercy of relatives who saw him more as free labor than family. The railroad had been his escape at 16, stringing telegraph lines across the expanding frontier, but even that freedom had come with a price. He unconsciously rubbed the scar on his right shoulder, a permanent reminder of the accident that had changed everything. A year ago, a poorly secured pole had given way during a storm. His partner, Samuel, hadn't been quick enough to jump clear. Theodore still woke some nights hearing the crack of wood and Samuel's cut-off scream. He'd left the telegraph company after that, drifting west until he'd heard about the auction in Dry Creek. All he'd wanted was a quiet place to forget, to work with his hands on something that wouldn't cost anyone their life. Isabella Marie Delgado, 24 years old, had her own ghosts to carry. Her father, Miguel, had come north from Chihuahua as a young man, following rumors of good grazing land. Her mother, Mary O'Brien, had scandalized her Irish immigrant family by marrying a Mexican vaquero. Together, they'd found this patch of earth and dug until they struck water-sweet water, which they'd named Ojo Dulce. The well had sustained not just their small herd and garden, but had saved more than one traveler from death by thirst during the bad years. The fever had come last winter, swift and merciless. Isabella had nursed both parents, but the sickness took them anyway. She'd buried them herself. The ground so frozen she'd had to build fires to soften it enough to dig. The neighbors who might have helped were gone, driven off by drought or bought out by bigger operations. She'd stayed because the alternative was unthinkable. Where else could she go? A woman alone, with her mixed heritage written in her features. No relatives to claim her, no money to start over. Theodore learned these pieces of her story slowly, drawn out over days of shared labor. Isabella was as strong as any man, hauling water, patching the chicken coop, setting snares for rabbits. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of hard work, her full figure a testament to strength rather than softness. When she rolled up her sleeves to work, he could see the corded muscles in her forearms, the capable hands that could gentle a spooked horse or swing a hammer with equal skill. "You're staring," she said one afternoon, catching him watching as she repaired a harness. "Just wondering how you managed alone all these months," he covered, though in truth he'd been admiring the way the sun caught the copper highlights in her dark hair. "Oh, you do what needs doing," she replied simply. "No point crying over what can't be changed." Theodore understood that philosophy. It was how he'd survived after his parents died, how he'd pushed through after Samuel. You kept moving, kept working, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking led nowhere good. The town of Dry Creek regarded their unusual arrangement with predictable suspicion. When they went to trade eggs for flour at the general store, Theodore could feel the eyes on them, hear the whispers behind hands. The shopkeeper, Benedict Arnold Hutchins, who despised his name and insisted on being called Dutch, shortchanged them on the scales until Theodore quietly pointed out the error. "Honest mistake," Dutch muttered, adding the proper weight. But not everyone was hostile. Harriet Bloom, a widow who ran a small boarding house, took a liking to Isabella immediately. "About time someone stood up to those land grabbers," she said, pressing a packet of seeds into Isabella's hands. "These are from my sister back east. Grow well, even in drought." The sheriff, Lafayette Burnham, was an older man with the deliberate manner of someone who'd learned that rushing to judgment usually meant judging wrong. He listened more than he talked, his weathered face giving away nothing as he made his weekly rounds. Thomas Standing Bear, whom the whites called Tom Broken Knife, proved an unexpected ally. The Paiute hunter had known Isabella's parents, had traded with them fairly when others wouldn't. He showed Theodore where to dig for clay that held moisture, a trick for keeping gardens alive when rain was just a memory. And then there was young William Cody, though he insisted everyone call him Birdie on account of how he could whistle any tune after hearing it once, 15 years old and all knees and elbows. He'd been drifting since his own folks died, picking up work where he could. Isabella found him trying to steal eggs one evening and instead of running him off, offered him supper and a job. "Can't pay much," she warned. "Don't need much," Birdie replied, wolfish in his eating but earnest in his manner. "Just a place to belong for a while." Theodore understood that hunger too, and without discussion, they took the boy on. The prejudice followed them like dust on the wind. In town, Isabella was that Mexican woman, or worse, the half-breed squatter. Theodore became the fool who took up with her, or the man who'd lose his property for a pretty face. The irony wasn't lost on him. Isabella's face was pretty, beautiful even, with those expressive dark eyes and strong cheekbones. But that wasn't why he stayed. He stayed because she was right, because she belonged here in a way that pieces of paper couldn't negate, because when she showed him the stone markers her mother had placed in 1884, marking the well's location, he saw the carefully carved initials and date, the love that had gone into claiming this small piece of earth. "Mama used to say water was life out here," Isabella told him one evening as they sat on the porch, the day's heat finally breaking. "Papa would laugh and say she was life, and water was just water. But they both knew, without the well, nothing else mattered." Theodore was starting to understand that too. Each day brought new challenges: a broken pump handle, chickens taken by coyotes, the constant battle against sand and sun. But each day also brought small victories. The first morning the windmill creaked to life after he'd spent 3 days repairing it. The evening Isabella smiled, really smiled, when he correctly pronounced acequia as she taught him the Spanish words for irrigation. The night Birdie played his harmonica, and even Tom stopped to listen, nodding approval. They established rules, Boundaries to protect both reputation and respect. Separate sleeping quarters. Divided chores. No entering private spaces without permission. If either broke faith, the other could leave with a fair share of the water rights. It was business, Theodore told himself, ignoring the way his pulse quickened when Isabella brushed past him in the narrow kitchen, or how her laugh made something tight in his chest ease. The first rumors reached them through Harriet, who'd overheard the men talking in Dutch's store. "They're calling it quite the scandal," she reported with obvious relish. "He bought a deserted ranch for $1 and found a curvy woman already living inside. Can you imagine?" Isabella's face darkened, but she kept her voice level. "Let them talk. As long as the water keeps flowing, their words can't hurt us." Theodore wasn't so sure. He'd seen how words could become actions, how prejudice could justify violence. The West was full of men who took what they wanted and found reasons later. But he kept his worries to himself, focusing on the work. There was always more work. The social landscape of 1896 Wyoming was as harsh as the physical one. The cattle companies ruled like feudal lords, buying up water rights, forcing out small ranchers. The law favored those with money to pay lawyers and bribes. A woman's claim to property was tenuous at best, a Mexican woman's claim almost non-existent. Theodore had seen it happen too many times. Families driven off land they'd worked for years because someone with connections wanted it. But here, now, he had a chance to stand for something different. Each night as he lay on his porch bed, listening to the coyotes and the wind, he thought about the life he'd run from and the life he'd stumbled into. Isabella never asked about his scar or the nightmares that sometimes woke him. He never asked about the tears he sometimes heard through the thin walls. They gave each other the gift of privacy, of space to grieve without witness. Yet, slowly, carefully, they were building something together. Not just a functioning ranch, but a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. When Isabella made coffee, she made it strong and black without asking. When Theodore fixed the loose board on the step, he did it without being reminded. Small kindnesses, accumulating like rain in a catchment basin, creating something that might, given time, overflow into something more. The rhythm of daily life on the ranch settled into a pattern as predictable as sunrise. Theodore would rise before dawn, climbing the windmill tower while the air still held a hint of coolness. His hands, once soft from telegraph work, grew calloused from gripping metal rungs and turning stubborn bolts. The mechanism needed constant attention. Sand worked into every joint, and the dry air cracked the leather seals. He'd learned to listen for the telltale squeaks that warned of trouble, applying precious grease where needed. Below, Isabella would already be at work, her figure moving efficiently between the chicken coop and the garden plot. She'd discovered which plants could survive on minimal water, the wild purslane that grew in sandy soil, the hardy amaranth her mother had cultivated. Every morning she'd check the makeshift channels that directed their precious water, patching leaks with pine resin and clay. Market day in Dry Creek came twice monthly, and it required careful planning. They'd load the wagon before dawn, eggs wrapped in straw. Wild herbs Isabella had gathered and dried. Sometimes a rabbit or two that Bertie had snared. The 15-mile journey took half the day, wheels creaking through ruts, baked hard as stone. The town square buzzed with activity on market days. Ranchers' wives traded gossip along with goods. Children darted between the stalls, and the smell of fresh bread from Harriet's booth made everyone's mouth water. Theodore noticed how conversations stuttered when Isabella approached, how some women drew their skirts aside as if her presence might contaminate them. "Pay them no mind," Harriet said loudly one morning, deliberately embracing Isabella in full view of the town gossips. "Some folks got nothing better to do than flap their gums." Dutch Hutchins still tried his tricks with the scales, but Theodore had taken to bringing their own weights. "Just keeping everyone honest," he'd say mildly, and Dutch would grumble but adjust the measures. It was at the market that they met other small ranchers fighting the same battles. James Marshall, who'd found gold in California before losing everything to claim jumpers, now scraped by on 40 acres east of town. His wife Elizabeth, a former schoolteacher, looked at Isabella with understanding rather than judgment. "The land doesn't care what color you are," Elizabeth said quietly. "It's hard on everyone equal." Sheriff Lafayette Burnham made a point of stopping by their stall, purchasing eggs he probably didn't need. The old lawman had a way of being present just when tension seemed ready to boil over. Theodore appreciated the subtle protection, even as he knew it couldn't last forever. Thomas Standing Bear proved invaluable, teaching them to read the land's subtle signs. "See how the rabbit brush grows thicker there," he'd point out. "Water runs underneath in wet years. Dig your catchment basin there." His knowledge came from generations of survival in this unforgiving landscape, and he shared it with the quiet understanding that they, too, were outsiders fighting to belong. Birdie threw himself into ranch work with the desperate energy of someone who'd been drifting too long. The boy was quick to learn, whether it was Theodore teaching him to read survey maps or Isabella showing him how to doctor a sick chicken. In the evenings, he'd practice his letters by lamplight, Isabella patiently correcting his spelling. One scorching afternoon, comedy erupted from chaos. A neighbor's pig, driven mad by heat and thirst, broke through their garden fence. The massive sow, easily 300 pounds, charged straight for Isabella's carefully tended bean plants. "Get that monster out of there," Isabella shouted, wielding a broom like a sword. Theodore gave chase, but the pig was surprisingly nimble, dodging around the water trough and through the squash vines. Birdie tried to head it off, only to slip in the mud and go sprawling. Even dignified Tom, who'd stopped by to trade, found himself pressed into service. Finally, Isabella had an inspiration. She grabbed a bucket of grain and laid a trail toward the gate. Whistling low and sweet, the pig, its rampage forgotten, followed the food peacefully out of the garden. "You could have done that from the start," Theodore panted, mud-splattered and sweating. "Where would be the fun in that?" Isabella's eyes danced with mirth. "Besides, you looked like you needed the exercise." They all collapsed in laughter, the kind that came from shared absurdity and the relief of catastrophe averted. Even Tom's usually stoic face cracked a smile. It was in that moment Theodore realized that they'd become something more than individual survivors. They'd become a family of sorts, bound by choice rather than blood. The first rumors reached them through Harriet, her eyes twinkling with mischief as she recounted the latest gossip from the saloon. "They're saying he bought a deserted ranch for $1 and found a curvy woman already living inside. Makes it sound like something out of those penny dreadfuls." Theodore's ears burned, but Isabella handled it with characteristic directness. "Let them talk while they're flapping their jaws. We're building something real." Still, the attention wasn't entirely welcome. Theodore noticed more riders passing by their property, slowing to stare. Some were merely curious, but others had the calculating look of men assessing value and vulnerability. The social structure of 1890s Wyoming was rigid in its hierarchies. The cattle barons sat at the top, men who measured wealth in thousands of acres and heads of cattle. Below them came the established ranchers, then the small farmers, and finally the drifters and displaced. Isabella, as a woman of mixed heritage, existed outside even these categories. Her presence at Theodore's ranch challenged unspoken rules about property, propriety, and race. Yet she navigated these waters with remarkable grace. When the banker's wife made cutting remarks about women who didn't know their place, Isabella responded by donating a basket of food to the church poor box, with a note specifying it was for all God's children, regardless of birth or station. When cowboys made crude jokes in her presence, she'd fix them with a stare that could freeze water in July, then continue her business as if they didn't exist. Theodore admired her strength, even as he worried about its cost. He saw how her jaw tightened when children pointed and whispered. how her hands clenched when proper ladies crossed the street to avoid her. But she never complained, never asked for his protection or pity. One evening, as purple shadows stretched across the ranch, they sat on the porch sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The desert had its own beauty at this hour, the way the dying light painted the rocks red and gold, the first stars appearing like promises in the darkening sky. "My mother used to say this was the magic hour," Isabella said softly, "when the earth remembered it was alive." She sounds like she was a wise woman. She knew every plant that grew within 20 miles, which ones healed and which ones harmed. The Mexican women came to her for remedies, and even some of the white ladies, when the doctor was too far or too expensive. Isabella's voice carried both pride and loss. She tried to teach me everything, but I was young and thought I had time. Theodore understood the weight of unfinished lessons. My partner Samuel used to say the same about his father's carpentry skills. Always meant to learn more. Always thought there'd be another chance. They sat in comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. These moments of peace felt stolen from a world that seemed determined to deny them rest. Theodore found himself memorizing small details, the way Isabella tucked escaped strands of hair behind her ear, how her face softened when she watched the sunset, the unconscious grace in her movements. But he kept these observations locked away. Their arrangement was business. He reminded himself, anything more would complicate an already precarious situation. Still, when their hands accidentally touched passing the water gourd, when he caught her scent of sage and sunshine, when her laughter rang across the yard, his carefully maintained walls showed cracks. The practical challenges never ceased. Water management remained their primary concern. The windmill could only pump when the wind blew, and some days the air hung still as death. They'd constructed a series of holding tanks from old barrels and sealed them with tar, but evaporation stole almost as much as they saved. Isabella proved ingenious at conservation. She'd direct the gray water from washing into the garden, mulched heavily with dried grass to hold moisture, and planted in clusters to create shade. Every drop was precious, measured out like liquid gold. Theodore, meanwhile, threw himself into improving their infrastructure. He reinforced the chicken coop against predators, built better nesting boxes to protect the eggs, and started planning a root cellar to store vegetables through the winter. Birdie proved an eager assistant, absorbing knowledge like the dry earth absorbed rain. "You're good at this," Birdie said one day as they worked on framing a new shed. "Building things. Had to learn," Theodore replied, checking the level. Nobody else was going to do it. "Is that why you left the telegraph company to build your own place?" Theodore's hand stilled on the wood. He rarely spoke of his past, but the boy's honest curiosity deserved some truth. Sometimes you leave because staying hurts too much. Sometimes a man needs to start over, build something new instead of maintaining what's broken. Birdie nodded as if this made perfect sense. Perhaps at 15 with his own losses. It did. As summer deepened, bringing temperatures that could bake bread on a rock, the small community they'd built proved its worth. When Isabella fell ill with heat exhaustion, Harriet appeared with cooling herbs and firm instructions for treatment. When rustlers hit James Marshall's place, Theodore and Tom rode out to help track them. When Birdie broke his arm falling from the windmill, Elizabeth Marshall said it with the competence of someone who dealt with frontier injuries before. They were building more than a ranch. They were weaving themselves into the fabric of the community, creating bonds that might, just might, prove stronger than prejudice and greed. But Theodore knew from experience that such hopes were fragile things, easily shattered by those with power and cruel intentions. For now, though, they had this, the evening light painting Isabella's face gold, Birdie's harmonica drifting on the breeze, Tom's quiet presence, a reminder that survival was possible against all odds. It wasn't the life Theodore had imagined when he'd bid that $1 at the auction, but increasingly, he couldn't imagine any other. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning. riding a blood-based stallion and wearing expensive leather despite the heat. Theodore was repairing the corral gate when he spotted the rider approaching, a young man with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. "You'd be Ramsey," the rider said without dismounting, his pale eyes scanning the property with proprietorial interest. "Name's Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. My uncle owns the Crowley Cattle Company." Theodore straightened slowly, hammer still in hand. He'd heard of Cornelius Crowley, who'd built an empire by squeezing out smaller ranchers, but this was their first direct contact. "What can I do for you, Mr. Rockefeller?" "It's more what I can do for you." The young man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My uncle's prepared to make you a generous offer. $500 for your water rights. That's 500 times what you paid for this place." "Not interested." "You haven't heard the full offer. We'd also guarantee safe passage out of the territory for you and your companion." The way he said the last word made Theodore's jaw clench. Isabella emerged from the house at that moment, rifle in hand but pointed downward. She'd obviously been listening. "This land isn't for sale, Mr. Rockefeller. Not for any price." The young man's expression hardened as he took in Isabella's appearance, her mixed heritage evident in her features, her work-worn dress, her defensive stance. "I wasn't addressing you, woman. This is business between men." "Any business concerning this ranch concerns me," Isabella replied evenly. "And the answer remains no." Rockefeller's horse danced nervously, sensing its rider's anger. "You're making a mistake. My uncle doesn't like being told no, and from what I hear, your claim to this land is questionable at best. A Mexican woman with no proper documentation, squatting on county property." "She's not squatting," Theodore said, stepping between them. "And you'll speak to her with respect, or you'll leave. Now." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Rockefeller smiled again, cold as winter wind. "Think about our offer, Ramsey. It won't remain open long. And things can get difficult for folks who don't know when to fold." He wheeled his horse and rode off, leaving a dust cloud and unease in his wake. That night, Theodore and Isabella sat at the kitchen table, the lamp between them casting dancing shadows on the walls. The legal situation was more precarious than they'd hoped. Isabella's mother had filed the original water claim under her maiden name, O'Brien, but had used her married name, Delgado, on other documents. The inconsistency created a legal gray area that someone like Crowley could exploit. "Maybe we should consider," Theodore began. "No," Isabella's voice was firm. "This is where my parents are buried. This is where they built their dreams. I won't let it go to satisfy some rich man's greed." Theodore studied her face in the lamplight, the determined set of her jaw, the fire in her dark eyes. He'd seen that look before, in soldiers who decided to hold a position no matter the cost. It worried him even as it stirred his admiration. The harassment started small. Cut fence wires that let cattle stray. The well rope frayed just enough to snap when Bertie was drawing water, sending the bucket to the bottom. Someone spread salt on a section of the garden, killing the plants Isabella had nursed through the drought. Sheriff Burnham investigated each incident, but without witnesses, his hands were tied. "I know what's happening," he told Theodore privately. "But knowing and proving are two different things. Watch yourselves." The pressure extended to town. Dutch suddenly couldn't extend credit for supplies. The blacksmith was too busy to repair their wagon wheel. Even Harriet reported being warned about associating with undesirable elements. It was James Marshall who brought them the most disturbing news. "Crowley's hired guns," he said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly. "Saw them myself at Bitter Creek. The Dalton brothers, Robert and Grattan. They've got a reputation for making problems disappear." Theodore felt the familiar weight of dread. He'd seen hired guns at work before, men who viewed violence as casually as others viewed weather. But when he looked at Isabella, He saw not fear but determination hardening into something diamond bright and dangerous. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Isabella had gone to check the fence line when young Rockefeller appeared again, this time with 2 companions. Theodore, alerted by Bertie, arrived to find them circling Isabella on horseback, crowding her against the barbed wire. Just trying to be neighborly, Rockefeller was saying, "Hate to see a woman like you struggling out here alone. Course, if you were smart, you'd take our offer and find somewhere more suitable." "The only thing unsuitable here is your behavior," Isabella replied. But Theodore could see her hand inching toward the pistol at her hip. "That's enough," Theodore called out, rifle visible across his saddle. "You boys are trespassing. Time to move along." Rockefeller's smile was ugly. "Boys, this here's the fool who thinks he owns something just because he's got a piece of paper. Doesn't understand how things really work out here." One of the companions, a thick-set man with scarred knuckles, laughed. Maybe we should educate him. The moment stretched taut as fence wire. Theodore could feel it all balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move and blood would spill. But before anyone could act, Thomas Standing Bear materialized from the brush, his hunting rifle trained steadily on Rockefeller's chest. 4 against 2 doesn't seem sporting," Tom said mildly. "How about we even these odds?" Rockefeller's face flushed dark. "This isn't your business, Indian." "Water is everyone's business," Tom replied. "And these people share theirs fairly. Not something I can say about your uncle." The standoff might have continued, but Sheriff Burnham chose that moment to appear, badge glinting in the sun. "Afternoon? Gentlemen, got a report of possible trespassing. Mr. Rockefeller, I believe you and your friends were just leaving." It wasn't a question. Rockefeller jerked his horse's head around, but not before delivering a parting shot. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." After they'd gone, Isabella's composure finally cracked. She sat heavily on a rock, hands trembling. Theodore dismounted and went to her, fighting the urge to pull her into his arms. "I'm fine," she said, though clearly she wasn't. "Just angry. They think they can take whatever they want just because they have money and connections. They're used to people backing down," Theodore said quietly. "But we won't. Not this time." That night, Theodore was checking the windows when Isabella stopped him with a hand on his arm. The simple touch sent warmth through him like lightning. "Thank you," she said simply, "for standing with me. Not all men would." "You don't need me to stand up for you," Theodore replied. "You were handling them fine on your own, but I'll always stand with you. That's what partners do." Something shifted in her expression, a softening that made his breath catch. For a moment, they stood frozen, her hand still on his arm, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Bertie clattered in from the porch, breaking the spell. "Saw lights moving out by the north pasture," the boy reported. "Want me to go check?" "No," Theodore said firmly, though his eyes remained on Isabella a moment longer. "We'll all stay close to the house tonight. Let them prowl. We'll be ready if they try anything." They set up watches through the night. Theodore first, then Isabella, then Bertie. Tom had agreed to stay, bedding down in the barn with his rifle. It felt like preparing for a siege, which perhaps it was. During his watch, Theodore found himself thinking about the path that had led him here. A year ago, he'd wanted nothing more than solitude and forgetting. Now he was preparing to fight for a piece of land that technically wasn't even his, alongside a woman who'd somehow become essential to his days, protecting a makeshift family he'd never planned to have. The night passed without incident, but they all knew it was just the beginning. Crowley had shown his hand, and he wasn't the type to fold easily. The question was how far he'd go, and whether their small alliance could withstand the storm that was coming. As dawn broke across the ranch, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold, Theodore made a decision. He found Isabella already awake, standing by her parents' graves with a cup of coffee. "We need to make this legal," he said without preamble. "Your claim to the water, the land, all of it. There has to be a way to prove your mother's rights transferred to you." Isabella nodded slowly. Tom mentioned an old surveyor in Bitter Wells. Ulysses Grant, they call him, though that's not his real name. He worked these parts back in the 80s. Might have records that predate the counties. "Then we'll go find him," Theodore said, "but carefully. If Crowley's men are watching—" "They are," Isabella said with certainty. "But we can't let fear keep us from acting. My parents didn't build this place by being afraid." Looking at her in the morning light, strong, determined, unbroken despite everything arrayed against her, Theodore felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. Whatever came next, whatever Crowley threw at them, they'd face it together, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The notice arrived at dawn, nailed to their gatepost like a declaration of war. Theodore found it when he went to check the horses, an official-looking document with the county seal, ordering the temporary cessation of water rights pending investigation of ownership claims. His stomach dropped as he read the formal language that essentially cut off their lifeline. Isabella took the news with a stillness that worried him more than tears would have. She stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the windmill that would now stand idle by legal decree. "They can't do this," Bertie protested, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. "That water's been yours for years." "They can do whatever they want," Isabella said quietly. "They have the judges, the lawyers, the money. We have what a few old papers and the truth doesn't win against gold." Theodore had never heard such defeat in her voice. It sparked something cold and determined in his chest. "We're not giving up. There has to be a way to fight this." The town was buzzing with gossip when they arrived for supplies. Theodore could feel eyes on them as they walked down Main Street, heard the whispers behind hands. At Harriet's boarding house, they found an unexpected gathering: James and Elizabeth Marshall, Tom Standing Bear, even old Sheriff Burnham, off duty but present. "Crowley's gone too far this time," Harriet declared, pouring coffee with angry efficiency. "Cutting off water rights. In this drought, that's attempted murder, plain and simple." "Law says different," Burnham said heavily. "That paper's all legal and proper. Judge Edison signed it himself." "Edison's in Crowley's pocket," James spat. "Everyone knows it." Elizabeth pulled out a bundle of letters. "I've been writing to my sister in Denver. She knows people in the territorial government. If we can prove the original claim predates the county's jurisdiction." "That's where Grant comes in," Tom interjected. "The surveyor in Bitter Wells. But the road there goes right through Crowley's land." Theodore felt Isabella's tension beside him. She'd been quiet throughout the discussion, but he could see her mind working, calculating odds and risks. "We'll go at night," she said suddenly. "New moon's in 3 days, if we're careful. If you're caught on Crowley's land after dark, they'll shoot you for rustlers," Burnham warned. And with that legal notice, they'd probably get away with it. "Then what do you suggest?" Isabella's voice carried an edge sharp as broken glass. "That we sit and wait while our animals die of thirst, while the garden withers, while they strangle us slowly and legally." That night, Theodore found her at her parents' graves again. The moon was waning, casting long shadows across the small cemetery. She'd brought water from their dwindling stores to tend the wild roses growing there. "My mother planted these," she said without turning. "Said every grave deserved beauty, even out here." Her voice caught. "I promised her I'd keep them alive." Theodore moved closer, close enough to catch her scent of sage and sorrow. "We'll find a way. I promise you that." She turned then, and in the moonlight he could see tears she'd never let fall in daylight. "Why does it matter so much to you? This isn't really your fight. You could take Crowley's money, start over somewhere else." The question hung between them like a challenge. Theodore thought of all the easy answers, about justice, about standing up to bullies, about keeping his word, but looking at her face, vulnerable and fierce in equal measure. Only the truth would do. Because somewhere between that first day you nearly shot me and now, this became my home too. Not the land, not the ranch, but— He struggled for words. The life we're building? All of us. That matters more than any money Crowley could offer. Isabella studied his face for a long moment, then stepped forward and kissed him. It was nothing like the careful, proper courtships he'd known back east. It was desperate and sweet and tasted of tears and determination. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she pressed her forehead against his chest. I'm scared, she admitted, the words muffled against his shirt. Not of Crowley or his guns, but of losing this, of failing them. She meant her parents. He knew, their legacy and dreams. You won't, he said, holding her carefully, as if she might break or bolt. We won't let that happen. But even as he spoke the words, Theodore could feel time running against them. Without water, they had maybe a week before the animals began to suffer. 2 before real desperation set in. The vegetable garden was already showing signs of stress, leaves curling in the heat. The next morning brought another blow. Birdie returned from town with supplies and a black eye. Rockefeller's men, he explained, wincing as Isabella tended the bruise. Said it was a warning. Said anyone who stands with you stands against Crowley. You should go, Isabella told him. Find work somewhere safe. This isn't your fight either. Birdie's young face set in stubborn lines. Like hell I will. Pardon my language, ma'am. But you took me in when nobody else would. I'm not running now. Theodore felt a surge of affection for the boy, mixed with fear. Crowley was escalating, putting pressure on every point. How long before someone got seriously hurt? The answer came that very night. Theodore woke to the smell of smoke and Birdie's frantic shouting. The hay barn was ablaze, flames already licking at the roof beams. They formed a bucket brigade, but with their water restricted, it was hopeless. They could only save what animals were inside and watch their winter feed go up in flames. By dawn, only charred timbers remained. Sheriff Burnham arrived to investigate, but they all knew what he'd find. Nothing. No evidence, no witnesses. Just another accident on a ranch that seemed increasingly prone to them. At least no one was hurt, Burnham said, but his eyes were troubled. Isabella stood staring at the ruins, soot-stained and exhausted. When Theodore touched her shoulder, she didn't lean into him as he'd hoped, but straightened instead, steel entering her spine. They want a war, she said quietly. Fine, but we don't fight it on their terms. That afternoon, she disappeared for hours, returning with Tom and a grim smile. There's another way to Bitter Wells, older trail through the Canyonlands. Rough going, but Crowley's men won't expect it. It's dangerous, Tom warned. That trail hasn't been used in years. Rock slides, rattlesnakes. And if you get caught in a flash flood— We leave tonight, Isabella decided. Theodore and I— Tom, can you and Birdie hold things here? You're not going without me, Theodore said immediately. She met his eyes. I'd hoped you'd say that. We'll need provisions for 3 days, ammunition, and what little water we can spare. As they prepared for the journey, Theodore caught her arm. Last night, what happened between us? Changes nothing, she said, but her eyes softened. And everything— We survive this first, then we figure out the rest. He wanted to argue, to define what they were becoming to each other. But she was right. Survival came first. Everything else, the kiss that still burned on his lips. The future he'd begun to imagine would have to wait. As darkness fell, they saddled the horses and loaded their supplies. Tom had drawn them a rough map, marking water sources and dangers. Birdie pressed extra ammunition into Theodore's hands, trying to look brave despite his youth. You bring her back safe, the boy said fiercely. I will, Theodore promised, hoping it wasn't a lie. They rode out under a starless sky, leaving the ranch that had become home, heading into hostile territory with little more than determination and each other behind them. The burned barn stood like a monument to Crowley's ruthlessness. Ahead lay the hope of proof that might save them, or the very real possibility that they'd never return. Isabella rode straight-backed and silent beside him, her father's rifle across her saddle. In the darkness, Theodore couldn't see her face, but he could feel her presence like a flame in the night. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. He'd meant what he'd told her. This had become his home. Not because of the land, but because of the life they'd built, the family they'd become. Now they just had to survive long enough to keep it. The Badlands stretched before them like a maze carved from bone-white rock and blood-red stone. Theodore had thought he understood harsh country, but this was something else entirely, a landscape that seemed actively hostile to human passage. They had been riding since midnight, following Tom's directions by stars and instinct, and now the first pale light of dawn revealed the true challenge ahead. Isabella led the way with a confidence that surprised him. "Papa brought me through here once," she explained, guiding her horse around a formation that looked ready to crumble. "Said it was important to know all the ways in and out of a place. Never know when you might need a back door." The trail, if it could be called that, was barely wide enough for a single horse. On their left, the cliff face rose sheer and unforgiving. On their right, the ground fell away into a canyon so deep the bottom remained in shadow. The horses picked their way carefully, sensing the danger in every step. By midday, the heat had become a living thing, pressing down on them like a weight. The rocks radiated warmth like oven stones, and their precious water supply seemed to evaporate with each sip. Theodore watched Isabella carefully, noting how she rationed her drinks, how she wet her lips sparingly. "There," she pointed to a cluster of yellow flowers growing from a crack in the rock. "Desert primrose. Only grows where there's moisture below. We can rest there." They found a small seep of water, barely enough to refill one canteen, but it was something, as the horses drank gratefully. Theodore and Isabella pressed themselves into what little shade the overhang provided. "You're full of surprises," Theodore said, watching her examine the trail ahead with knowing eyes. "A woman alone learns things or dies." She replied matter-of-factly. "Papa made sure I could survive without him. Mama made sure I'd want to." They were preparing to move on when Theodore heard it, the distinctive sound of shod hooves on stone. He grabbed Isabella's arm, pulling her behind a boulder just as 3 riders came into view below them on a parallel trail. "Rockefeller," Isabella breathed in his ear. The young man was unmistakable even at a distance, his expensive hat and silver-studded saddle catching the sun. With him rode 2 hard-looking men Theodore recognized as the Dalton brothers, Robert and Grattan, gunmen with reputations as harsh as the landscape. "Said they headed for Bitter Wells." Robert Dalton's voice carried in the still air. "Only 2 ways to get there from their ranch." "Then where are they?" Rockefeller demanded petulantly. "We've been riding since before dawn." "Maybe they took the old canyon trail," Grattan suggested. "Though they'd be fools to try it. That trail's a death trap." "Then let them die on it," Rockefeller snapped. "Saves us the trouble, but I want to be sure. You 2 circle back, check the main road again. I'll push on to Bitter Wells." Theodore felt Isabella tense beside him. If Rockefeller reached the surveyor first, but the gunmen were already turning their horses, heading back the way they'd come. They waited, hardly breathing, until the sound of hooves faded completely. "We have to beat him there," Isabella said urgently. "He's got fresher horses and an easier trail," Theodore pointed out. "Then we don't stop. We push through." They rode harder now, urgency overcoming caution. The trail wound through formations that looked like they'd been shaped by a mad god-twisted spires, narrow slots that forced them to dismount and lead the horses. Sections where ancient floods had carved the rock into smooth, treacherous chutes. It was in one of these narrows that disaster nearly struck. Isabella's horse, startled by a rattlesnake's warning, reared and scrambled for footing. For a heart-stopping moment, horse and rider teetered on the edge of a drop. Theodore lunged forward, grabbing the bridle, his own mounts training the only thing keeping them all from going over. When they were safe on solid ground, Isabella's hands shook as she patted her horse's neck. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes said more. Night caught them still in the canyonlands, but they couldn't stop. By Theodore's reckoning, they had maybe 10 miles to go, but those miles included some of the worst terrain yet. They tied the horses together, Isabella leading while Theodore brought up the rear and pressed on by moonlight. It was past midnight when they finally emerged from the Badlands onto the plateau where Bitter Wells squatted like a canker. The town was smaller than Dry Creek, just a handful of buildings clustered around the spring that gave it its name. But there was a light burning in one window, the surveyor's office, according to Tom's information. They approached carefully, aware that Rockefeller might have arrived first. But the street was empty save for a drunk sleeping against a water trough. Theodore knocked on the door while Isabella kept watch. The man who answered looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts, tall and gangling, with a white beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen too much. "Help you folks." His voice was surprisingly cultured. "We're looking for Grant," Theodore said. "The surveyor. It's about the old Delgado claim on Ojo Dulce." The man's eyes sharpened. "Delgado. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while. You'd better come in." The office was cramped and cluttered, maps covering every surface, survey equipment gathering dust in corners. Grant, whose real name, he informed them, was Benjamin Franklin Pierce, listened to their story while brewing coffee strong enough to float horseshoes. "I remember the Delgados," he said when they'd finished. "Good people. Miguel helped me when my horse went lame out near their place. And yes, I have the original survey." He pulled out a leather-bound ledger, pages yellow with age. "Here, surveyed and recorded in 1884 before the county was even properly organized. Water rights clearly established." Isabella leaned forward eagerly. "But my mother's name—" "Is listed both ways," Pierce confirmed. "Mary O'Brien, also known as Mary Delgado. I made sure of it. Seen too many claims, jumped on technicalities." He produced another document. "And here's her will, properly witnessed, leaving everything to her daughter, Isabella Marie. I kept copies of everything. Never know when someone might need proof." Theodore felt relief wash over him. This was what they needed. But Pierce wasn't done. "There's something else you should know. Crowley's been buying up judges. But Judge Edison has a weakness. He's a stickler for proper documentation. You show him these originals, properly authenticated, and he'll have to rule in your favor. His vanity won't let him ignore clear evidence." They were carefully packing the documents when the door burst open. Rockefeller stood there, pistol drawn, the Dalton brothers flanking him. Well, seems you made better time than expected." Theodore's hand moved toward his gun, but Robert Dalton already had his weapon trained on him. "Don't be stupid, friend." "Those documents are mine," Isabella said, stepping forward despite the guns. "You have no right." "Rights," Rockefeller laughed. "Out here, rights come from the barrel of a gun. Hand over those papers." "No." Isabella's voice was steel. Rockefeller's face darkened. "Grattan, convince her." The gunman stepped forward, reaching for Isabella. It was a mistake. She moved faster than Theodore would have thought possible, driving her knee up hard while yanking Grattan's gun hand down. The weapon discharged into the floor, and suddenly everyone was moving. Theodore dove left, drawing and firing in one motion. His shot caught Robert Dalton in the shoulder, spinning him around, Pierce moving with surprising agility for his age. Threw the lamp at Rockefeller, plunging the room into darkness. In the chaos that followed, Theodore could hear furniture crashing, men cursing, Isabella's fierce yell as she fought. He managed to find her in the dark, pulling her toward where he remembered the back door being. They burst out into the alley, Pierce somehow still with them, clutching the precious documents. Their horses were where they'd left them, and they mounted quickly, behind them. Rockefeller was shouting orders, but Theodore had the satisfaction of hearing confusion in his voice. They rode hard for the canyon trail, knowing pursuit would follow, but hoping their knowledge of the dangerous route would give them an edge. As they entered the first narrow passage, Theodore heard Isabella laugh, wild and free despite everything. "Did you see his face when you shot his hired gun?" she called back. "Did you see his face when Pierce threw that lamp?" Theodore responded. Even Pierce chuckled at that. "Haven't had that much excitement in years. Glad I could help." Dawn found them deep in the Badlands again, but this time with hope riding alongside. They had the proof they needed. Now they just had to survive long enough to use it. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and determination. They pushed the horses as hard as they dared, taking risks with the trail that made Theodore's heart pound. But they made it through, emerging onto familiar ground just as the sun reached its zenith. What they found at the ranch made them forget their exhaustion. Tom and Bertie had not been idle. The yard was full of people: James and Elizabeth Marshall, Harriet Bloom, Sheriff Burnham, and at least a dozen other small ranchers and townspeople. "Figured you might need some witnesses when you got back," Tom said with a rare smile. "Assuming you found what you went for." Isabella held up the documents like a battle flag. "We found it! We found everything!" The crowd erupted in cheers, but Theodore noticed Burnham's expression remained serious. "Rockefeller rode in about an hour ago," the sheriff said quietly. "Mad as hell and claiming you shot his men. I'll need to hear your side of it." "Self-defense," Pierce said firmly. "I'll swear to it in any court. They drew first and threatened a lady. These folks just defended themselves." The sheriff nodded slowly. "That's good enough for me, but Crowley won't take this lying down. You'd best be ready for—" He was interrupted by a cloud of dust on the horizon. Riders, many of them. The crowd tensed, hands moving to weapons. But as the group drew closer, Theodore saw something unexpected. Judge Edison himself rode at the front, his black coat dusty but his bearing still imposing. "I received word of a dispute regarding water rights," the judge announced, dismounting with dignity despite his obvious discomfort from the ride. "Given the serious nature of the claims and counterclaims, I've decided to convene court here and now. Is there somewhere we can conduct proper proceedings?" The makeshift courtroom in Dry Creek's wooden church fell silent as Judge Edison reviewed the documents spread before him. Outside, Theodore could hear the restless shuffling of the crowd that couldn't fit inside. It seemed half the county had come to witness this showdown between Crowley's money and the Delgado claim. Theodore sat in the front row, Isabella's hand steady in his despite the bandage wrapped around his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him during their escape. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, but Harriet and Tom had cleaned and dressed it properly. Isabella herself bore a purple bruise along her jaw from the fight, which she wore like a badge of honor. Cornelius Crowley occupied the opposite side of the aisle, flanked by two lawyers in city suits that looked absurdly out of place. The cattle baron was a thick-set man with cold gray eyes and hands that had never known hard labor. Beside him, Rockefeller nursed his own injuries, a black eye and singed eyebrows from Pierce's lamp. "The court recognizes the gravity of this matter," Judge Edison began, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Water rights in this territory are indeed a matter of life and death. Let us proceed with proper decorum." Crowley's lead lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Alexander Hamilton Price, stood first. "Your Honor, the matter is simple. The county records show no valid claim under the name Delgado. My client purchased the surrounding lands in good faith, with the understanding that the water rights were unclaimed and therefore you—" "Objection," Isabella interrupted, standing despite protocol. Those rights were claimed and recorded before the county even existed. Judge Edison frowned at the breach of procedure but nodded. The court will examine all evidence. Miss Delgado, please present your case. Isabella moved forward with a grace that belied her exhaustion. She laid out the story simply. Her parents' arrival, the digging of the well, the establishment of their homestead. Then she presented Pierce's documents. The original survey, Your Honor, conducted by a licensed territorial surveyor in 1884. She placed the leather-bound ledger before him. Note the clear establishment of water rights for the property known as Ojo Dulce, claimed by Miguel Delgado and Mary O'Brien Delgado. Price jumped up. Your Honor, the inconsistency in names is fully addressed here. Pierce interjected, stepping forward. I conducted that survey myself, and I specifically recorded both names to prevent just such a challenge. It was common practice for women to be known by both maiden and married names. Judge Edison studied the documents carefully, his expression unreadable. The courtroom held its breath. Furthermore, Isabella continued, here is my mother's will, properly witnessed, leaving all property to me. And here, she produced another paper, is the record of my parents' marriage, showing the legal connection between Mary O'Brien and Mary Delgado. These could be forgeries, Price argued desperately. Then let's examine the county's own records, Sheriff Burnham suggested, producing a box of files. I took the liberty of bringing them. You'll find tax payments made by the Delgados going back years, all properly recorded. The evidence mounted piece by piece. Elizabeth Marshall testified about helping deliver Isabella at the ranch, establishing her birth there. Tom Standing Bear spoke of trading with the Delgados since the 1880s, always at the same location by the well they dug. Even Dutch Hutchins, subpoenaed reluctantly, had to admit he'd been buying eggs and produce from the Delgado ranch for over a decade. Crowley's face grew darker with each testimony. When Rockefeller was called to explain the confrontation in Bitter Wells, his story unraveled quickly under questioning. You drew weapons first, Judge Edison asked pointedly. We were protecting Mr. Crowley's interests. Rockefeller mumbled. By threatening citizens and attempting to steal legally held documents. The young man had no good answer to that. Finally, Judge Edison called for silence. The packed church held its breath as he deliberated. Theodore could feel Isabella trembling beside him, all her strength focused on maintaining composure. The court finds, Edison began slowly, that the evidence overwhelmingly supports the prior claim of the Delgado family to the water rights of Ojo Dulce. The claim predates county organization and has been continuously maintained through residence and improvement of the land. A cheer began to rise, but Edison raised his hand for silence. Furthermore, the court finds that the recent attempts to intimidate and dispossess Miss Delgado constitute criminal conspiracy. Mr. Crowley, Mr. Rockefeller, you and your associates will face charges for assault, attempted theft, and destruction of property. This is outrageous, Crowley exploded, surging to his feet. You can't. I can and I have, Edison replied coldly. Sheriff, please take Mr. Rockefeller into custody. Mr. Crowley, you will post bond and appear for trial. What happened next occurred almost too fast to follow. One of Crowley's men, who'd been lounging near the door, went for his gun. His target was clear, Isabella, the woman who'd beaten them. Theodore saw the movement and reacted on instinct, throwing himself forward. The bullet meant for Isabella caught him in the same shoulder that was already wounded, spinning him around. Through the explosion of pain, he heard Isabella's scream of rage, saw her draw her father's pistol with smooth efficiency. Her shot was perfect. The gunman's weapon flew from his hand as Isabella's bullet struck it, probably breaking several of his fingers in the process. The man howled, clutching his injured hand, as Sheriff Burnham and several deputies swarmed him. Anyone else? Isabella asked, her voice deadly calm as she kept her weapon trained on Crowley's remaining men. "Anyone else want to try their luck?" No one moved. Theodore found himself on the floor, Isabella kneeling beside him, her hands pressed against his shoulder to staunch the bleeding. Her face was fierce with worry and something else, something that made his heart race despite the pain. "Don't you dare die on me, Theodore Ramsey!" she said fiercely. "Not now. Not after everything." "Wouldn't dream of it," he managed, though the edges of his vision were going gray. Harriet and Elizabeth were there suddenly, competent hands dealing with the wound. Through the haze of pain, Theodore heard Judge Edison's voice, steady and implacable. "Let the record show that Miss Delgado acted in clear self-defense. Mr. Crowley, your man will be charged with attempted murder. I suggest you reconsider your approach to business in this county." The next hours blurred together. Theodore remembered being carried to Harriet's boarding house, the doctor's pronouncement that the bullet had passed through cleanly. Missing anything vital? He remembered Isabella's presence, constant as shadow, her hand in his as fever burned through him. He woke properly near dawn, weak but clear-headed. Isabella was asleep in a chair beside his bed, her head pillowed on her arms. In the soft morning light, he could see the toll the past days had taken, the shadows under her eyes, the worry lines that hadn't been there before. "You're awake." Harriet's whisper from the doorway was pleased. "She hasn't left your side. Stubborn as a mule, that one." Theodore smiled weakly. "I know." Isabella stirred at their voices, her eyes flying open. The relief in them when she saw him conscious made his breath catch. "You fool," she said, but her voice was thick with emotion. "Jumping in front of bullets. What were you thinking?" "That I couldn't lose you," he answered honestly. "Not when we just won." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his good shoulder. "We did win, didn't we? The ranch is ours. The water is ours." "Ours?" Theodore asked softly. Isabella pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes serious. "Did you think I'd let you leave after this? You're stuck with me now. Theodore Ramsey, the ranch needs both of us. I need—" Her voice broke slightly. "I need you." "Is that a proposal, Miss Delgado?" Despite everything, he found himself grinning. "Maybe it is," she replied, matching his smile. "What's your answer?" "Yes," he said simply. "To everything. To the ranch. To the future. To you. Yes." She kissed him then, careful of his injuries, but thorough in her intent. When they broke apart, both were breathless. "Birdie's been spreading the story all over town," Harriet informed them with obvious glee. "How you faced down Crowley and his guns, won your case, and then saved each other's lives. They're already calling it the legend of the $1 ranch." "He bought a deserted ranch for $1, Isabella quoted with a laugh, "and found a curvy woman already living inside." "Found my future," Theodore corrected. "Found my home." Over the following days, as Theodore healed, the community rallied around them. Crowley, facing serious charges and public disgrace, sold off his local holdings and retreated to his properties in Texas. Rockefeller was convicted of assault and conspiracy, spending 6 months in prison before his family's influence got him released on condition he never returned to Wyoming. The ranch began to thrive again. With the water rights secured, they could expand the irrigation, plant more crops, increase their small herd. Neighbors who'd been too frightened to stand against Crowley now came forward, offering help and friendship. Sheriff Burnham married them 3 weeks later. Once Theodore could stand without swaying. It was a simple ceremony in the yard of the ranch, with Tom standing bare playing his flute and Birdie trying not to cry. The entire community of Dry Creek seemed to attend, turning it into a celebration of more than just a wedding. It was a celebration of justice prevailing, of courage rewarded, of love found in the most unlikely circumstances. As the sun set on their wedding day, Theodore and Isabella stood together by the well that had started it all. The windmill turned steadily in the evening breeze, pumping life into the land. "No regrets?" Isabella asked, leaning into his embrace. "Only one," Theodore admitted. "I should have paid $2 for this place. It was worth at least that much." Isabella's laughter rang across the desert, bright as the stars beginning to appear overhead. "Come on, husband. Let's go home." They walked back to the house together, past the roses blooming on her parents' graves, past the new barn rising from the ashes of the old, past the gardens growing green with promise. Behind them, the windmill sang its creaking song, and ahead, their future waited, uncertain as always in this hard land, but theirs to face together. The legend would grow in the telling, as legends do, but at its heart would always be the truth, that sometimes love comes when you least expect it, that courage can overcome greed, and that home isn't just a place, but the people who stand beside you when the world tries to tear you down. Spring arrived with a whisper of rain on the wind, the first real moisture in months. Theodore stood on the porch, Isabella beside him, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. The desert responded to the rain like a miracle, tiny flowers blooming in carpets of yellow and purple, the air itself seeming to soften and breathe. "Never thought I'd see it," Bertie said from where he sat mending harness. At 17 now, he'd grown tall and steady, no longer the desperate boy who'd tried to steal eggs. Green grass in Wyoming, actual green grass. "The land was just waiting," Isabella said softly. "Like it knew better times would come." The ranch had transformed over the past year, where once a single windmill had struggled to pump enough water for basic survival. Now 3 stood sentinel over the property. The garden had expanded into neat rows of vegetables and herbs, protected by adobe walls Bertie and Tom had helped build. The small herd of cattle had grown to 30 head, each one healthy and strong. But the biggest change was in the community itself. The Ojo Dulce Water Covenant hung framed in the church, signed by every small rancher in the valley. It was simple in its provisions. Water would be shared according to need, with priority given during drought, reserves maintained for emergencies. No one would go thirsty while others had excess. "It's what my parents would have wanted," Isabella had said when they drafted it. "Water is life. Life should be shared." The idea had spread beyond their immediate area. Letters came from other communities, asking for copies of the covenant, advice on water management, stories of how they'd stood up to Crowley. Theodore answered them all. With Bertie's help, the boy had become an able secretary, his handwriting now clear and strong. Theodore watched his wife move through their home with quiet pride. Marriage had changed them both, deepened them. He'd learned to voice his fears about the accident that still haunted him, about Samuel's death. She'd shared her grief over her parents, the loneliness of those months alone. Together, they'd found that old wounds could heal when tended with gentle hands. A dust cloud on the horizon announced visitors. These days, that usually meant friends rather than threats. Sure enough, it was the marshal's wagon, with Harriet Bloom riding alongside on her sturdy mare. "Brought the new school books," Elizabeth called out, climbing down with James's help. "And Harriet has news from town." They gathered in the kitchen, the heart of the home, where Isabella served coffee and fresh bread. The talk was of ordinary things, crop prices, the new family that had bought the old Crowley place, plans for the harvest dance. It was the kind of conversation Theodore had never known to value until he'd nearly lost the chance for it. "Oh, and this came for you." Harriet produced a letter with a flourish. From the territorial capital, no less. Theodore opened it, read, then read again in disbelief. "They want to hire me as a water rights mediator, travel the territory, helping resolve disputes like ours." "That's wonderful," Elizabeth exclaimed. But Isabella had gone still. "It would mean being away," Theodore said quietly, watching his wife's face. sometimes for weeks. I won't take it if—" "You should," Isabella interrupted. "This is important. What we learned, what we did, others need that knowledge." She took his hand. "Besides, you think I can't manage. I was doing fine before you showed up." "You were," he agreed. "But we're better together." "Which is why you'll always come home," she said simply. "This is your anchor, but you can help people." "Theodore, you should." That evening, they danced on the porch as Bertie played his harmonica. Now quite skilled after Tom's teaching, the sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the windmills turned lazily in the breeze. Other neighbors had come by, Tom with news of antelope moving through, the new family seeking advice on well digging, even Dutch from town with a grudging gift of peppermint sticks for the baby when it comes. "Look at what we've built," Isabella murmured against Theodore's chest as they swayed together. "Not just the ranch, all of this community, family." "From a $1 purchase and a shotgun greeting," Theodore replied, making her laugh. "Best dollar you ever spent." "Best dollar anyone ever spent." Summer brought the baby, a daughter with Isabella's dark eyes and Theodore's stubborn chin. They named her Mary Rose, for both grandmothers, the night she was born, with Harriet and Elizabeth attending. A rare summer thunderstorm rolled through, bringing sheets of life-giving rain. "She brings the water with her," Tom said when he came to visit. "That's a powerful sign." The ranch became a hub of activity. Theodore's new position meant ranchers and farmers came seeking advice, staying for meals and conversation. Isabella started a Sunday gathering where women could share knowledge, everything from preserving food to managing accounts. Bertie, inspired by all the learning happening around him, announced his intention to study law to help folks like us who don't have fancy lawyers. One evening, as autumn touched the desert with cooler air, Theodore found the old newspaper clipping Bertie had saved. The headline still made him smile. He bought a deserted ranch for $1 and found a curvy woman already living inside. "Rereading our story?" Isabella asked, shifting baby Mary to her other arm. "Thinking how it should end," Theodore replied. "And they lived happily ever after seems too simple." "How about, and they lived?" Isabella suggested. "Through drought and flood, through hard times and good. They lived fully, building something that would last beyond them." Theodore pulled her close, careful of the baby between them. Outside, the windmills turned steadily, pulling water from deep in the earth. The garden rustled with the promise of harvest. Cattle lowed contentedly in the pasture. From the bunkhouse came the sound of Bertie practicing his letters, preparing for the entrance exams to law school. "And they lived," Theodore agreed, "with purpose, with love, with hope." The stars emerged one by one overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first wary meeting, their desperate fight for justice, their wedding under this vast sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did in this unforgiving land. But tonight, they were home, they were together, and they were free. The $1 ranch had become something more than property or profit. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people stood together, when love grew in unlikely ground, when courage faced down greed. The story would be told and retold, growing in the telling, but at its heart would always be this simple truth. Sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the greatest challenges. As if in agreement, Mary Rose gurgled happily, reaching for her father's face with tiny, perfect fingers. Theodore caught her hand gently, marveling at the miracle of it. This life, this love, this land that had tested them and made them stronger. "What are you thinking?" Isabella asked softly. "That I'm the richest man in Wyoming," Theodore replied, "and it only cost me $1 to discover it." Isabella's laughter rang out across the desert, bright with joy and promise. From the house, warm lamplight spilled onto the porch, welcoming all who came seeking water. wisdom, or simply the warmth of human connection. The windmills sang their eternal song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate under the infinite sky. The ranch thrived, the family grew, the community strengthened, and in the annals of the West, the tale lived on of a man who bought a deserted ranch for $1, found a remarkable woman already living inside, and together they built something worth more than all the gold in California. The legend was already being shared in saloons and Sunday gatherings, around campfires and kitchen tables, each telling added new details, new drama. But the heart remained true. It was a story of the American West at its best, where courage, determination, and love could overcome any obstacle, where justice could prevail over power, where two people could build a life worth living on little more than hope and hard work. And so they lived, not forever, for nothing lasts forever under the desert sun, but fully, richly, leaving their mark on the land and the people whose lives they touched. The $1 ranch became a symbol of possibility, and the water from Ojo Dulce continued to flow, bringing life to all who came with honest need and open hearts. Thank you all for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and exchange thoughts about this journey through the Old West. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit that hype button to help more people discover these tales of courage, love, and adventure from America's frontier days.